Hi Room 17, it's Miss Long, and for today's lesson I'm going to be focusing on creative writing and specifically how to write an entertaining beginning for any story you have in mind, whether it's a funny story, a scary story, action, adventure, fantasy, realistic fiction. So anything you are thinking about writing in terms of a story to tell, that's what I'm going to be talking about. And we all want our audience to be interested in whatever we write. So I want to show you how to make a good first impression, because that's important when we begin a story, making sure we make that good first impression, how to hook your audience so that they don't want to put your story down and they don't want to stop listening, and also just starting out strong. So you want to make sure your beginning is an interesting, entertaining, and engaging one. So everyone want to hear your story. So I'm going to tell you about what really doesn't make an interesting beginning. And these are beginnings I've read many, many times as a teacher. These are bills of boring beginnings. So boring as in I've read so many stories that start out with one day I went to the park. One day I saw a giant dinosaur. One day I spent Christmas with my family and we opened presents. One day this, one day that. So we want to avoid this beginning if at all possible. Okay, so many young writers start that way and we want to try to spice it up, okay? So one day we're going to try to eliminate that as a beginning when we start our stories. Another beginning that's used a lot and doesn't always work is once upon a time. Once upon a time is used for fairy tales, and often if we start a story with once upon a time I went to the park, you know, that's not really a fairy tale story. It's more like realistic fiction. So once upon a time, we're going to save that for fairy tales. Okay, I'm going to cross that out. And then there's the tell-all, or today I'm going to be saying kind of beginning. Today I will tell you about is not something that will really interest your audience. So that is out as well. So that being said, how in the world do you start a good story? What makes a great beginning for a story? So I'm going to be showing you some examples. Some ways to start a story in a powerful way includes action. Okay, action is great because it starts right away with a character doing something. So this, on the back of this card, I have the beginning of a story. It's from The Whipping Boy by Sid Fleischman, and it starts out like this. Hold your nose, Billy popped a clove of garlic into his mouth, ground it between his yellow teeth, and helped him to a veal pie. And you kind of get a sense of who this character is. I mean, to eat a raw clove of garlic, I cannot imagine, but it starts right away with an action, how he pops that clove of garlic into his mouth. So that, again, is action. That's literally the beginning of that book. Okay, so we have action is one way to start a story. Another way to start a story that will hook your audience is with a question. So here's an example from a book called Blue Heron by Avi, and it starts out like this. What, Margaret Lovchek asked herself, was magic really for? So that's a beginning, starting with a question. Another way to start a story is with thoughts and feelings. So here's what I mean, thoughts and feelings. This is the third way. Here's the beginning of a book called Herbie Jones and the Class Gift by Susie Klein. And this is what she writes to begin her story. Herbie Jones hated indoor recess, especially in June. So you get a sense of what Herbie Jones is thinking and feeling. So again, that's thoughts and feelings. All right, and then we've got another powerful way, effective way to start a story is with dialogue. And dialogue is whatever characters are saying in the story. Usually you can tell if it's dialogue if you've got quotation marks, and you'll see that right here. So I don't know if you could see that. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. There we go. There's quotation marks showing that a character is speaking. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the doghouse," replied Mrs. Arable. "Some pigs were born last night." And this is from a famous book that you probably have heard of called Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. So, and that's dialogue. And then one of my favorite ways to start a story is with a sound effect. And this can be especially fun. And many students I've taught really have fun using this technique to start a story. So here's an example of sound effect. Baroom, baroom, boom, barippity, 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 barippity. Good. His dad had the pickup going. He could get it up now. So this is from a book called Bridge to Terabithia by Catherine Patterson. So you can hear in the story that sound of the pickup truck starting up, just with these sounds. And with sound effects, one reason why it's so fun is you can make up words. You can make up the sounds. Okay, that's sound effect. Now these, I didn't have actual printouts of the story beginnings, but I found these and thought about how some other authors use, they describe the setting in the beginning of the story to start it out. So a setting, for example, I'm going to pull up an actual book here. For example, this is a book called Crickwing by Janelle Cannon. I love this book. And I'm going to read the beginning. And again, she uses the setting. She describes the setting to start her story off right away. You're going to notice she does not start with one day. She does not start with those other boring beginnings. She doesn't start with once upon a time either. So we're going to start taking a look at this beginning. Listen. Far below the great forest canopy lies a shadowy world that many insects call home. So that right there counts as the beginning, but we can move on and read a little bit farther. Among the damp clutter of fallen leaves and branches, leaf-cutting ants toil all day, while large cockroaches await their evening search for food. So this alone, this one paragraph, this beginning, is so powerful because we get a sense of the setting, and it's described so beautifully here. You can really imagine being there almost. So that is a story called Crickwing, and that has to do with, I'm going to pull this up again, setting. You're describing the place for the story, where the story takes place. Here's another example of setting. This is also by Janelle Cannon, and it's called Stella Luna. And this is how Janelle Cannon begins this story. In a warm and sultry forest far, far away, there once lived a mother fruit bat and her new baby. So this starts right away with a description of the forest, warm and sultry. They even introduce the characters here too, the mother fruit bat and her new baby. Okay, so that is all about setting. But there's other ways. One more way I wanted to show you about introducing a story, and that is with a character. Just describing that character is such an effective way of starting the story off. And here's an example from a book called Shrek by William Steig. he describes the character. His mother was ugly, and his father was ugly, but Shrek was uglier than the two of them put together. Again, William Steig describes the character to begin his story. Alright, so we talked about that. I'm going to give you some examples, and I'm going to see if you have been paying attention to these different story beginning strategies or techniques. So again, there's action, there is question, thoughts and feelings, dialogue, sound effect, setting. I guess this is, can't quite squeeze in my frame, but also character. So all these are ways to start a story. There's so many different ways, and it can be fun to learn how to use each one of them. So what I would like to do is see if you can figure out, when I read the beginning of some of these stories, what strategy or what writing technique did the author use. Here's the beginning of a familiar book, Listen Buddy, by Lynn Munsinger. And it starts out like this. Buddy's father had a beautiful big nose. He was a great sniffer. So I'm going to ask you now, what writing technique did the author use? Did she use character? Did she use setting, thoughts and feelings, action, sound effect, dialogue, or a question? I'm pausing to let you think. You're right, it's character. So she describes the character first. She's describing Buddy's father. Very good. Okay, here's another one that's really fun. I have not read this to you before, but I want to introduce just the beginning. It's called Wolf by Becky Bloom. Try to figure out how the author begins the story. After walking for many days, a wolf wandered into a quiet little town. He was tired and hungry, his feet ached, and he had only a little money that he kept for emergencies. Sometimes you might a combination of writing techniques, but maybe you can figure out what this may be. I do see a combination here, so sometimes you might hear me read a story beginning and you might have different ideas. They might have more than one technique going on here. So think about it. Okay, if you thought that the author started the story with action, you're correct, because the wolf wandered into a quiet little town. They're talking about what the wolf is doing, so that is an action. However, if you also thought that this beginning includes thoughts and feelings, you're also correct, because the wolf is tired and hungry and his feet ached. So it's talking about how he's feeling. So this is a very rich beginning. Okay, this here is one of my favorite books. You probably have heard of the movie, maybe. It's called Coraline by Neil Gaiman. I've read this book several times. I love it so much, and I'm going to share the beginning of this book. Coraline discovered the door a little while after they moved into the house. So think about this. Is it character? Is it thoughts and feelings? Is it action? Sound effect? I don't know about you, but I don't see any sound effect going on here. So we're thinking about how Neil Gaiman begins the story. So one hint is I have one of the correct answers is right here. If you believe that Neil Gaiman started the story with action, you are correct, because Coraline discovered the door. So that's Coraline. This is My Father's Dragon. It's written by Ruth Stiles Gannett. And I'm actually going to start at chapter 2. I know that's not quite the beginning of the book, but it's the beginning of the chapter. And beginning of chapters count too. So here is the beginning of My Father's Dragon, chapter 2. Wild Island is practically cut in two by a very wide and muddy river, continued the cat. This river begins near one end of the island and flows into the ocean at the other. So it actually continues with more, but there's a character in here who's talking. So if you guessed that this author started the chapter with dialogue, you were correct, because the character is the cat that is speaking. Okay. Here is another book called Holes. I'm going into more like middle school level books. This is one of my favorites too. Holes by Louis Saker. And I bookmarked 2 beginnings for 2 chapters. Here's chapter 2. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. There we go. The reader is probably asking, why would anyone go to Camp Green Lake? So again, I'm going to pull this up and ask you how the author, Louis Saker, began the story. Did he use a character? Did he use thoughts and feelings? Did he use a sound effect? Did he use a setting? Or question? Or dialogue? Action? So I'll let you think about that for a couple seconds. And you are correct if you thought that Louis Saker started the story with a question. You are correct, because again the question says, the reader was probably asking, why would anyone go to Camp Green Lake? And that hooks the reader right away, makes you wonder, why would they go to Camp Green Lake? So that is Holes. Okay, I've got a bunch of examples here. Thanks for watching, class, and thank you for thinking about how we can begin our stories in a very entertaining way. Here's A Camping Spree with Mr. McGee by Chris Van Dusen. Let's see how they start this story. And not one of these books starts with the boring beginning one day. Early one morning at 7:03, Mr. McGee and his little dog Dee packed up the camper and hitched up the load, hopped in the Rambler, and then hit the road. So I'll let you think about that for a moment. Okay, and if you thought that the author started with action, you are correct, because it's talking about what Mr. McGee and his dog are doing at the beginning of the story. I thought I could pull out Harry Potter. And Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, starts with lots of engaging beginnings for every chapter. Let's take a look at the very beginning of this book. So the chapter is The Boy Who Lived, Chapter 1. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. So think about that for a moment too, and ask yourself, what kind of story beginning is this? So I believe there might be two kinds of story beginnings that J.K. Rowling is using. I believe she's using character because she is talking about Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. But she's also using possibly a little bit of thoughts and feelings because it says they're proud. They're proud to say that they were normal. So it talks about what they are feeling and what they are thinking. Okay, that is the beginning of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Okay, you still with me? I have a few more of these books left. It's fun to share these story beginnings and talk about them. Fish is Fish by Leo Liani. And here's the beginning of Fish is Fish. Let's take a closer look. At the edge of the woods there was a pond, and there a minnow and a tadpole swam among the weeds. They were inseparable friends. So think about that for a moment. And if you think that the author started with the setting, you are correct because it mentions the edge of the woods and there was a pond. But they also introduced the characters too, which I think was nice. So this author is using two strategies in a way. Okay, this is more of a middle school book that I've read for myself. It's called The Landry News. Let's think about how Andrew Clements starts this book. So this is chapter 1. Cara Louise, I am talking to you. Cara Landry didn't answer her mom. She was busy. So how did this story start? Again, I'm going to pull out my little cards to remind us. So you got action, or sound effect, or is it dialogue, or a question, or maybe thoughts and feelings? What do you think? What story beginning did Andrew Clements use to start us off? There's also, don't forget, there's setting as well and character. Alright, if you guessed it was dialogue, you're absolutely right because it starts out with, Cara Louise, I am talking to you. And there's quotation marks to show that the mother is talking. So it's a very powerful, kind of takes you by surprise kind of beginning. And one last book that I'm going to show you is Chrysanthemum. So we're revisiting this just to take another look at the beginning. Chrysanthemum by Kevin Hanks. The day she was born was the happiest day in her parents' lives. She's perfect, said her mother. Absolutely, said her father. And she was. She was absolutely perfect. So I think, and some people might disagree, and some of you might have different ideas, and that's great. So if you have some ideas, you can share with me later on. But I believe, when I'm reading this, that this has to do with thoughts and feelings, because it starts with the day she was born was the happiest day in her parents' lives. It tells you how the parents are feeling and what they're thinking. However, I'm seeing dialogue here too. So it could be that you can say, hey, this author's using dialogue as well, and you're right about that. So that is our last example that I wanted to share. Okay, so that being said, with all these different story beginnings that we've been talking about, these are in any author's, any writer's toolbox for when they begin stories, when they start writing. They know how to start with one of these techniques. So whatever we do, we want to avoid the boring beginnings. So here's an example of a boring beginning. One day, I went to the beach. Now that we know of our more interesting beginnings, we can start off, for example, like this. I can start with a sound effect. How about that? Let me start with a sound effect, such as, so I have to think in my head, in my imagination, what is it that I would hear at the beach? Because I want sounds from the beach. Whoosh went the waves that washed across the sand. So that is one way I could start. Instead of saying, one day I went to the beach, I can say now, whoosh went the waves that washed across the sand. So that is a sound effect that I'm using. Or maybe I could start the story off differently. Whoops, sorry about that. I might start it with the action. For example, I can say, I wiggled my toes in the wet, warm sand. I've got sand again, but that's what I'm thinking of. Sometimes if I'm walking barefoot on the beach, that's what I'm imagining. So this is an action, right? It's something I'm doing. I'm wiggling my toes. So that is another beginning. And let me just try one more. I don't have time to show you all of them, but and then maybe you're thinking of a beginning for this boring beach story that's hasn't quite started yet. So we have to start with an interesting, entertaining beginning. Maybe I can start with how about if I start with thoughts and feelings. I was so happy about our beach picnic. I felt my heart bursting. Okay, so this is thoughts and feelings. I felt happy. I felt my heart was bursting. So that's another way to start your beach story if you wanted to. Let me know how you would start your beginning. If you wanted to write your own beach story. One day I went to the beach and just change this. Okay, this is so boring. So, I mean, it's correct in everything. You have all the words and you have something going on here if you wanted to start your story out that way, but it's really not the most exciting way to start your creative writing. So I'm here to show you and share with you how you can start on a writing journey with making things more interesting, more entertaining, and we'll be sharing more of that in our writing time together in class this year. So I look forward to hearing your stories, more of them, and just seeing what kind of imaginative, creative ideas you come up with. So Room 17, that wraps up my lesson today for how to write an entertaining story beginning, and we'll be practicing this some more. Take care, Room 17.